Welcome back, everyone, to our second day of our virtual Climate Leadership Conference. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'm Nat Keohane, President of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, or C2ES. Along with the Climate Registry, we co-host these annual Climate Leadership Awards and Conference. And we're thrilled to host our second day of speakers and to hear from our 2021 Climate Leadership Award winners. Thank you for joining us today. I'd also like to take a moment to thank more of our sponsors, who include the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the Bank of America, Ansell, Natural Capital Partners, Jacobs, Pacific Gas and Electric, Blue Source, Universal Insurance Holdings, Guidehouse, Georgetown Climate Center, and Apex. Thank you to all of you. In today's session, we're going to look at how 5 major electric and gas utilities are transitioning to a low-carbon future. Electricity production generates the second largest share of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, and about 2/3 of US electricity still comes from burning fossil fuels. As a growing number of utilities make ambitious commitments to achieve net zero emissions by mid-century, progress toward those goals is dependent on their investments today. If we look at how far we've come over the last 20 years, the power sector reduced its carbon dioxide emissions by 40% between 2005 and 2020 by switching from coal to natural gas, improving power plant efficiency, and increasing solar and wind power generation from nearly 0 to over 10%. But the next 10 years will decide our ability to reach those decarbonization goals. We need an unprecedented expansion of clean energy sources, and we need to innovate to transform our grid infrastructure in order to enhance the system's reliability and provide the flexibility needed to integrate intermittent renewable resources, improve the storage capacity, and add new fuels such as green hydrogen. And while we're doing all of that, we also need to strengthen the grid's resilience against the annual and increasing impacts we are seeing from climate change. Now, a few housekeeping items before we start. First, this will be a moderated discussion where I'll be asking our speakers questions. We're recording this panel discussion, and it will be available on the Climate Leadership Conference's YouTube site. Also, a reminder to all of you who are attending the conference, you can network and connect with your fellow attendees by checking out the People tab next to Chat on your Hopin platform and searching to set up a private meeting with others who are also attending the conference. Now let's get to the program. I'd like to first introduce our 5 distinguished guests who all lead utilities with public commitments to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 or sooner. We are proud to be joined by Ralph Izzo, the Chair, President, and CEO of PSEG, Gerry Anderson, the Executive Chairman of DTE Energy, Maryam Brown, the President of the Southern California Gas Company, Robert Blue, Chair, President, and CEO of Dominion Energy, and Leo Denault, Chairman and CEO of Entergy Corporation. So let's start with you, Ralph. Ralph, PSEG has decided not to invest in new fossil fuel plants. I've heard you say that to affect company decisions, you need to affect their financials, where companies see a monetary benefit in their short and longer term investments. What role does policy play, and what policies are needed to align those financials with a low carbon future?
Well, thanks, Nat, for having me here. And it's a pleasure to share this particular panel with my colleagues. Well, you said it yourself, Nat. The electric utility sector has done a phenomenal job of reducing its carbon emissions. We're now second only to transportation in those emissions. Having said that, we have to recognize that the reason why we switched to natural gas as an industry was that natural gas was lower cost than other alternatives. Notwithstanding the efforts on the part of various states to apply kind of a patchwork quilt of renewable portfolio standards, the primary carbon reduction was purely economic. It was the switching of fuel to a lower cost fuel. So the challenge that we have today is that we don't have a price on carbon. The existential threat posed by climate change, while it's increasingly being felt in the moment, its consequences are going to be felt in the future with increased intensity. So economists, I believe, refer to that as an externality. And without a price on carbon, the market can't efficiently allocate resources. So to have the most efficient decisions being made, not only by energy companies, but by transportation companies, by other users of energy resources, be that homeowners or heavy industry, a visible price on carbon would inform decisions so that they would be made with the minimum amount of economic consequences. So I've learned, however, over the years in battling for a policy to effectuate climate mitigation, to not let perfection be the enemy of the good. And while an economy price on carbon would be the best approach, in my opinion, absent that, I really do have to applaud the members of Congress who are active today in talking about a whole range of options that can put an implied price on carbon. These are production and investment tax credits for nuclear and renewable energy. These are appliance standards. These are carbon reduction standards. These are grant programs for research into advanced technology. So all of these suggest a price on carbon, or at least a value of minimizing carbon, and companies will respond to that. But I'll repeat myself and conclude by repeating myself. The best way to get there would be to have an economy-wide price so that it's not just comparing one fossil fuel versus another, or one renewable energy versus a fossil fuel in the power industry, but that we can compare maybe agricultural practices or transportation decisions against power production decisions and make what is the wisest choice for the economy as a whole and for the planet as a whole. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Ralph. That's a great description and a great capsule presentation of the value of a price on carbon, but also the suite of other policies that can help create those right incentives, even if we don't get that sort of first best approach. And glad to hear you talking about that full suite of policies. So, Gerry, let me turn to you next. DTE still has a significant coal fleet, at nearly 50% as of 2020. And I know that's front of mind for you as you consider how to cut DTE's carbon emissions. So what does the path forward for you and for DTE look like to accelerate the retirement of coal? And again, what do you need in terms of a policy framework to do that?
Well, first of all, Nat, thanks for doing this. And I'm going to give kudos to Bob Perciasepi for pulling you in to lead this organization. That was I knew you at EDF, and it was a great choice. So you'll do great things with C2ES. So yeah, you are right. Like much of the Midwest and Southeast, historically, electricity production in Michigan had a heavy mix of coal. And so reducing carbon emissions at DTE just requires this systematic step away from coal as a fuel. And to date, we're in that process, obviously. To date, we've retired 4 plants, the most recent of which was earlier this year, our River Rouge power plant. Next year, 2022, will bring 2 more coal plant retirements, our Trenton Channel power plant south of the city and our St. Clair plant north of the city. And that will leave us at DTE with 2 remaining coal-fired plants. And actually, yesterday there was a news release about one of those remaining 2 plants, our Bell River plant, which announced that we announced that we'll be stepping away from coal as a fuel there earlier than had been in our integrated resource plan. So look, we are very focused on engineering this systematic step away from coal. It is the way that we're going to get our net zero goal met. And as we systematically move away from coal, we have been investing heavily in renewables. That's by far been our dominant generation investment, with enough natural gas to keep system reliability hanging together. Now, to date on the renewable front, our investments have been dominated by wind because wind economics were clearly superior for much of the investment period. But we are now moving into heavy wind siting resistance in the state. You can hardly build a new wind park in Michigan. And so we're transitioning to large-scale solar investments. And fortunately, the economics of solar have now moved to essential parity with wind. They were not there some years ago. They are now. So we'll transition to solar. And interestingly, for us at DTE, a big piece of the renewable build-out is being done in a voluntary renewable program where customers who want to meet their own sustainability goals step up to sign up for offtake. And look, this isn't a sort of a small feel-good program we have going. We are building thousands of megawatts of dedicated solar facilities to meet the needs of customers like GM and Ford, who've signed up for 100% renewable take in the state of Michigan at their big production facilities, the University of Michigan, the Detroit Airport, Detroit Zoo. Lots of big customers like this, in addition to thousands of small and mid-sized businesses and residential customers. So just interesting that a big part of our step here in the coming decade is going to be customers voluntarily taking an aggressive stance. But I have to say that heavy investments in renewables and batteries are not going to get DTE all the way to net zero. We can drive our carbon down 80%, maybe a little more, by taking a path of renewables and enough gas to hold together reliability. But the last 20% or so requires some new solutions. And that is because winter in Michigan is a time of near peak and soon will be peak electric load. And it's also the time of peak space heating demand when winter becomes intense. And as we electrify space heating, that sort of doubles down on electric load in the winter. But winter is also by far our period of lowest renewable production in the state and in the region more broadly. We experience extended periods that we call renewable droughts, where we'll be getting a capacity factor anywhere from 0 to 10% on our wind and solar facilities. And so, to meet needs, those peak needs in the winter today, Michigan and the region more broadly, and really the country, rely on the 5 trillion cubic feet of natural gas that are stored around the country. And that gas is flowed out across the winter to meet demands like those I've just described. And that 5 trillion cubic feet of gas really is a huge version of a battery for the energy sector for our country. But even though gas is lower carbon than coal, it's not zero carbon. And that's why we've got to find a way to transition from that form of storage and generation to alternative forms of zero carbon dispatchable generation. That is going to be a critical development for Michigan. We have, to make it to net zero, we have got to have commercial scale hydrogen or gas with carbon capture or small modular reactors or some combination of those that come together. But I'll also say that this is not unique to Michigan, this last 20% challenge. You hear it from most leaders in the industry that they've modeled it carefully, and that last 20% requires new solutions, which is why current federal legislation is funding R&D on those technologies at more substantial levels than ever, and is providing tax incentives to try to push them along. I guess I'll just finish up by saying that I'm optimistic. You've already mentioned our sector is down 40%. That happened a lot faster over the past 5 years than I expected, or I think really anybody expected. And I think that the rapid reductions are going to continue. I led a strategy session at EEI recently for our executive committee. And in advance of that, I called every CEO and asked the pecking order for their strategic priorities. And number one for essentially every CEO in the industry is how to push this transition to clean energy and lower carbon. So with that sort of focus, I think it's going to continue to move fast, and maybe faster than we think. And with that, Nat, I look forward to the questions to come.
There, and a lot that I think we'll be coming back to. You implicitly, the regional issue that, Michigan, of course, faces different challenges than other parts of the country, but you also touched on some of the commonalities. That 80-20 piece, I think, is something I've heard a lot. There's a real pathway to 80% below what we're going to need technological innovation to get the rest of the way. And then, of course, you also touched on electrification and the electrification of other areas, and that's something we'll get back to later on. But for now, let me go to Maryam. And Maryam, you're in a different position than the other folks on this panel as the president of a gas utility. So I want to ask you, SoCalGas has a goal to achieve net zero emissions in your operations and delivery of energy by 2045. That includes what Climate Walks call scopes 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions. Probably most of our audience knows what that is, but basically all of the emissions that you're responsible not only for internally, but also the use of your fuels. How is SoCalGas looking to tackle that challenge?
Thanks very much, Nat, for the question and the opportunity to be here. And I think what we're going to find in this conversation is that there are a lot of common themes between us. I think some of Gerry's comments, I think, are consistent with ours and how we're approaching this issue. I think that the issues that we all face, evolving the energy industry to be what it will be in the next generation, is going to take companies like ours working together and leading. I think it's an issue of leading or be led. There is obviously no playbook for a net zero future. So first and foremost, to be able to reach our goals to reduce emissions, I think that we are very encouraging of collaboration, like the kind of discussions that we're having today that C2ES has set up, and sharing ideas with academics and policymakers and environmentalists and researchers, because the decarbonization goals that we've set, that all of us have set, it is as transformative in my mind as the Industrial Revolution and the Transportation Revolution combined. And so, our shared mission that I think we all have, no matter where it is that you sit, no matter what jurisdiction it is that you have, is to build a 21st century energy system. And to us, a 21st century energy system is clean, and it is resilient, and it is affordable, and it is integrated. And I think, the first question is what it is that we mean by clean. And I think that we all mean, and we all see a need for increased renewable electricity penetration on the electric grid, solar and wind energy. But more renewable electricity on the electric grid means more, not less, capability of the gas grid to meet the peaks that come with the intermittency of those renewables, and that can't be met with batteries alone. Gerry touched on this, but clean also means renewable gases. So gas, like electricity, can be renewable. It is one of the tools in the toolbox. Renewable gases, both renewable natural gas and hydrogen, and we're particularly high on green hydrogen in California, hold great promise to be a part of our energy future, we think. Hydrogen and renewable natural gas have particularly important roles that they need to play in heavy-duty transportation, as well as the industrial sector. Areas like cement and steel and refining, and the LA basin is actually the largest manufacturing basin in the country. So this is an issue that we think it is really important to have the role of renewable gases. These are areas where electrification would be challenged to meet needs because of the heat properties required. Hydrogen and renewable natural gas, they're also super important, as Gerry mentioned, for dispatchable power. Times like nighttime and times when you have extended cloud cover. In our mind, and particularly in California, RNG is definitely a now technology that is flowing through our pipelines today. And hydrogen is evolving, but very quickly, and it requires investment now for it to be able to meet its 5 and 10-year horizons. I think to accomplish our goals that we have at SoCalGas and all of us broadly, we are also very focused on resiliency. And resiliency is different from reliability. Some on this audience are very knowledgeable about that, but sometimes these terms are used interchangeably, and they are not the same. Reliability is our energy system working under standard operating conditions. Reliability is something that we have engineering plans around, and it is used 100 times in the Federal Power Act. I had my team look it up. And by contrast, resiliency, a topic that is at the top of most discussions these days, it doesn't appear once in the Federal Power Act. And I think this is a really exceptional time in the energy policy world. I think that we are the generation of energy policy business leaders and policy leaders that are going to define resiliency, design resiliency, and build resiliency into the energy system. So resiliency is the system operating under anything but standard, right? In California, the issues are wildfires and mudslides, and I know that in other areas of the country, the issues are it could be cold and hurricanes and extensive cloud cover again. There is an inherent resiliency that a molecule will always have over an electron, and there is an inherent resiliency in a system that is largely underground, like the gas pipeline system. And so I think that resiliency is why clean fuels like RNG and hydrogen complement clean electricity so very well. They really are perfect partners. So we're clear-eyed about the challenges of a net zero energy future, but we're excited to work with stakeholders. I share the enthusiasm about the opportunity side and conferences like this one to be able to build the future. Back to you, Nat.
Well, thanks so much, Maryam, and you really laid out, I think, the broader picture for how we power our economy and some of those additional issues we need to think through. And I really appreciate your highlighting resiliency as well, which we'll come back to in just a minute. But let me turn next, Bob, to you. Your Dominion is a leader in the push to jumpstart the offshore wind industry, and you also operate the third largest utility scale solar fleet. So you're a leader in renewables. What needs to happen on policy to drive more investment into deploying renewables, and what role do you see for, in particular, for distributed and residential solar in your service territory?
Well, thanks, Nat. Thanks for the opportunity to participate on the panel. A lot of the policy issues that are important for renewable development at scale, you've already heard from Ralph and from Gerry and from Maryam. We are a leader in offshore wind. We actually operate the only 2 turbines in federal waters off the coast of the United States. We've been doing that for about a year, and that's been going really well. And we're developing a 2.6 gigawatt project in the same area, which is about 27 miles off the coast of Virginia Beach. So if you think about, we're going to construct 180 turbines, 27 miles off the coast, each of them about 820 feet tall. That is a significant investment. And so as I think about the kinds of policies that are important for us to be able to make investments like that, at the top of the list is consistency and certainty. We're making, all of us in this industry, even in this transition, we made these kinds of investments in fossils years ago, and now we're making investments in renewables. They are long-term, they are capital intensive. In Virginia, we have a goal to get to more than 5 gigawatts of offshore wind. For our company to build that out, we estimate that's a capital cost of about $17 billion over a 15-year period. We need to know that policies aren't going to change. We need to have them consistent throughout. And obviously, we've all seen that with federal tax policy related to renewables. As tax credits look like they may be expiring, it affects the industry. And having some understanding of long-term consistent policy is really important. Goals, and our company agrees with Ralph, a carbon tax would be the most economy-wide, would be the most logical way to do this. But to the extent that there are other plans, many of them, as Ralph mentioned, sort of state renewable portfolio standards and other kinds of targets, those targets need to be aggressive and they need to be realistic. We think in Virginia, there's a good example of that. And again, it's what has allowed us to move forward with the kind of investment we've made. A statute that passed in 2020 called the Virginia Clean Economy Act sets us on a path to a carbon-free grid by 2045, with an understanding that we need to maintain the reliability of that grid. Third, I would mention timely permitting. This is a substantial amount of infrastructure that our companies are going to have to build in order to meet demand, particularly as we move to more electrification. And as we think about the kind of infrastructure that we have to build, a big chunk of it will be electric transmission. And we need to be able to permit electric transmission in order to deliver from where we're generating renewable electricity to where people actually live, to the load. And we're not talking about relaxed standards. We're just talking about timeliness. A permitting process should be thorough, and it should have a beginning, and it should have an end. And we should understand what that time frame is going to be so that we can get these projects done. And then you've heard others mention this. The fourth category I would note is R&D. For us to be able to deploy renewables at scale, we need other technologies that are going to help fill in the gaps. And that may be hydrogen to get seasonal storage, something longer term than a battery. It could be small modular reactors. It could be carbon capture and storage. But those kinds of federal policies, that kind of federal investment will be really valuable to continuing large-scale renewables. As to distributed generation, we have quite a bit on our system already, and I expect that everyone represented on this panel does as well. I will say initially it's important to think about, if we're trying to decarbonize as quickly as we can, as cost effectively as we can, scale matters. And decarbonizing rooftop by rooftop is not going to be the fastest, cheapest way to decarbonize. That being said, we see that our customers in many instances are looking for more distributed generation. We're adding more distributed generation. We operate today about 100 generating sites. By the end of the decade, we'll be at 400. So we're going to need to adjust the grid to adapt to that change in the way that the grid operates. But we see there will be continued either net metering customers or community solar customers. We have the ability to enable that as long as we do it in a way that's not subsidizing generators. We think distributed generation has a role to play, but to decarbonize quickly and cheaply, scale still matters.
Well, thanks, Bob. That you've raised a number of other points, some of them reinforcing what we've heard around technology, but the other points around the real need for clarity and consistency in policy when you're making massive investments and devoting huge amounts of capital, and then that point about the distributed generation and the ways that can complement scale, but also the needs for the grid. Really important point as well. So, Leo, let me turn to you last. Much of your customer base at Entergy is in the heavy industrial sector, and I know you're working with those customers to provide electrification opportunities and power that has a low emissions footprint. Tell us a little bit about Entergy's current generation mix and your transition to net zero emissions in the context of thinking about how to provide electrification to that industrial base.
Sure, Nat. And again, I want to say thanks for allowing me the opportunity to speak with you. I wish only that we were actually doing it here in New Orleans. Would have been a lot more fun in person to be able to do that. But I'm going to at first incorporate by reference everything that the other panelists have said. Very, very similar point of view about how we transition on an economy-wide basis to decarbonizing, the entire economy, not just the power sector. And I think that's important. And it even goes back to what Ralph had mentioned and Bob, I think, brought up as well, that price on carbon and how that could have been useful to be able to really drive decarbonization across the entire economy, not just focusing on the electric sector. And for us, it's a pretty dynamic opportunity. I know nationwide, the electricity sector is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions behind transportation. But in the area of the country where we operate, it's third. because the industrial sector is far greater emitter of greenhouse gas emissions than we are in the utility industry. And so we've got an opportunity in the electrification space, not only in transportation, but in general industry, when you think about the Gulf Coast of the United States and all of the industrial activity that not only exists here and has for a number of years, but is actually still growing because many of our customers are the most advanced, the newest, the most technologically advanced, and the most competitive facilities of their kind, not only in the United States, but in the world, with access to all the things that you need access to actually compete in worldwide markets, whether it's the Port of New Orleans and all the ports that are down here, or the Gulf of Mexico itself. So a big opportunity for them. And if you think about it, and if you were to just go to the websites of all of our customers, you would see that all of them also have decarbonization objectives with interim goals and net zero goals, just like we do in the utility industry. And the opportunity for us is to work with those customers to be able to provide them the opportunity to get there with their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So the first place where we start, and we've been working with them, is on their scope 2 emissions, which obviously include us as their electric provider. Those emissions are counted in those scope 2, and we want to reduce those. Our ability to reduce our emissions footprint of our power generation portfolio to 0 by 2050, as we've committed, is going to help get them in that portion of scope 2 emissions that we contribute to 0 as well. Now they want to accelerate that, so electrification is also an opportunity for us. What we've been doing is really decarbonizing our portfolio since 2001, when we decided to make a commitment to limit our greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, we were the first utility in the United States to voluntarily limit our greenhouse gas emissions when we did it back in 2001. We've continued to reduce those emissions through the continued operation of our regulated nuclear fleet, zero emitting power at scale, which is very, very important. You heard Gerry talk about new technologies and small modular reactors, but I think we would all agree that to meet our decarbonization objectives as a society, we need to keep the existing nuclear fleet operating with that large scale zero emitting power that it provides. So continue to invest in our nuclear fleet and the transition of our portfolio away from coal. We have very little coal left today, and by the time we get to 2030, we'll have ceased to burn coal on our system at all. We've transitioned our gas fleet from legacy inefficient gas units to newer technology that's far more efficient, that provides a 40% less of a carbon footprint than the gas plants that they replace, while we today build out a large fleet of renewables, pushing towards about 5 gigawatts by 2030, unless we can accelerate that, which we think we can. Contrary to what Gerry mentioned, wind resources, and Nat, you'd mentioned the regional nature here, wind resources are not really efficient here in the Gulf South, but solar is. So right now, what we're looking at for the majority of the build out of our portfolio will be solar. In addition to that, similar to Maryam, if you look at Louisiana and Texas, other than California, that's where the hydrogen game is, with about 60% of the infrastructure of hydrogen in the United States in Louisiana and Texas, whether it's production, transportation, storage, and the utilization, and things like refinery, et cetera. We're going to investigate building out our new dispatchable portfolio to be able to be dual fueled at hydrogen and natural gas. In fact, we're developing a power plant in Texas as we speak that will be hydrogen capable day one, with the intended ability to get to 100% capable on hydrogen. And when it gets to that point, it will actually be able to be 100% hydrogen, 100% natural gas, or anywhere in between in terms of the blending, to provide that long duration and seasonal storage that all of us need to be part of that last 20% that Gerry was talking about. When we look at the industrial sector, our participation with them will be to accelerate the reduction in their scope 2 emissions by bringing forward our renewable portfolio, which we can do similar to what Gerry talked about with, for example, green tariffs where they participate. So, for example, in Arkansas, we filed for our Green Promise tariff, which allows our commercial and industrial customers to participate by taking the offtake of our renewable resources as we build them. And we've already got that oversubscribed basically with letters of interest from customers, including folks like Walmart, et cetera, who want to participate as they meet their objectives more quickly than they otherwise would. That'll allow us to actually accelerate how quickly we build those renewable resources that would have been part of our plan anyway. When we look at the scope 2 emissions of those industrial and commercial customers, where they are significantly larger than the emissions we have, electrification today brings down their emission footprint because of the trade-off of the fossil fuels that they're utilizing in their process versus our clean electric fleet. Already today is a trade. It's the kind of thing that would have happened in a carbon price environment where you would go towards the most efficient reduction of carbon first, where it's a real positive NPV. So today, whether that's electrifying ships in port or whether that's providing green energy for carbon capture to create blue hydrogen that then we later use in our hydrogen capable facilities, there's a big opportunity for the general industry and for us to really make a dent in decarbonization. And as I said, it's unique down here in the Gulf South because of the size of that emissions footprint of all of these industrial customers who, as I mentioned, all have decarbonization objectives. Some have had them for a long time, others are just developing them, and we're working with them to be able to help them accelerate their meeting of those commitments. And I think it's a commitment that we're all making because of the same desire to decarbonize. We've got our investors, we've got our customers, we've got public policy, and our communities all want us to get on the same page. And it's really been a pleasant surprise to see where we've come as a country today in this decarbonization objective across all technologies, looking outside of the electric sector into general industry as well, versus where we were 20 years ago when we started down this path. So we're really excited about what the future holds.
Great description of the breadth of things you're doing, especially with the industrial sector, and really interesting to hear that is the second largest sector in the Gulf region. I actually want to pick up on this theme we were just diving into deeply there in terms of electrification of other sectors, and turn it back to Ralph and Gerry and Bob. So we're gonna expand this a little bit, and now that we've done one of those each, I'll sort of do a moderated panel here, really calling on whoever wants to jump in. But let me start with that question about electric utility expansion. It's something a number of you all picked up on earlier in your remarks, and Leo just did a deep dive. As we, I think every model that I've seen, certainly, that looks about how the US can get to net zero really does involve lots of expansion of the electric sector in terms of electrifying transportation and buildings and industrial processes. So I'm interested in what challenges and opportunities you all face as you think about that future and that expansion of electric demand. And I guess by default, I'll go in the same order I did before. So maybe I'll go Ralph, Gerry, and Bob, and then of course, Leo, if you want to add anything, and Maryam, I'll come back to you with a specific question in a sec as well. But Ralph, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll be brief to give my colleagues time. We're genuinely excited by the opportunities. Our number one objective is to help people use less energy. So believe it or not, we're investing heavily in energy efficiency. We have a $1 billion program over the next 3 years that's aimed at reducing electricity demand by 2% and gas demand by a little bit less than 1%. After that, we're trying to make sure that the electric supply stack, because you can't reduce to zero, stays as carbon-free as possible. For us, that means keeping our nuclear plants alive and investing in offshore wind. We don't have the same footprint that Bob and the folks at Dominion do, but we are part of a 1 gigawatt project off the coast of New Jersey. And then we have a $200 million program aimed at starting to build the infrastructure for electric vehicles to begin that process of electrifying the entire economy. So it really does begin with first reducing. So our shareholders get the same benefit from a programmable thermostat and an LED light bulb as they do a transmission tower. it takes a lot of light bulbs and thermostats to equal the transmission tower. But from the point of view of how it's treated on a regulatory point of view, they're identical. So reduce what you use. Make sure that what you do use is cleaner than ever before. And as so many have said, including Maryam, you're not going to be able to get to zero. So what we do deliver, we have to deliver with a higher degree of reliability and resiliency, which means adaptation investments. And as you, I'll conclude here, as you continue to electrify the economy, that resiliency is going to become even more important, because in the past, when the home lost power, it meant resetting a bunch of clocks. In the future, it'll mean not being able to charge your vehicle, it'll mean not being able to charge your phones, not being able to do work on your computer, and a whole litany of other really catastrophic consequences. So the number of opportunities are vast. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Gerry.
Yeah, well, I'll mention two electrification domains or opportunities. I mean, electric vehicles is the next big opportunity. And look, I'm headquartered in Detroit. I see daily announcements of investments that companies here are making to push the pace of that. So I feel that one's going to move faster, just like decarbonization may, faster than is being projected. And we can handle that. It's going to come in gradually. It will intensify peak load some, but not. We can control when people charge and so forth. So I think we're well positioned to pull in a lot of additional load there and reduce carbon as a result. Now I'll contrast that to electrifying building heating in Michigan, where the natural process would be air source heat pumps. They're improving in technology. They're a bit economically challenged, but that'll be solved. But back to my earlier point, putting all of the electric heat or all of the heating in Michigan on electric and off of gas would more than double our winter peak load, which simply doubles down on the question, what is that dispatchable form of electricity that's going to draw on what source of zero carbon fuel in order to meet that peak? Because if it's not going to be natural gas with carbon capture, which I suppose it could be, we're going to need hydrogen or something else. And so it'll come, I'm clear on that, but we really need these new technologies to be developed and commercialized fast if sectors like building and home heating are going to be able to transition in a way that is workable for system reliability.
Thanks, Gerry. And Bob, let me invite you if you want to jump in on this question.
Sure. Just real quickly, from our perspective, the opportunity with respect to electrification is to give our customers what they want. They want decarbonization. Ralph pointed out correctly, reducing the amount of energy they use is an advantage, but also the type of energy they get. They are looking for less emitting energy, and this, as we electrify, will give us an opportunity to give it to them. When they drive an electric car, I can assure you they'll want an electric car because those cars are incredible to drive. But we also think from our company's perspective about the fact that, as Maryam pointed out, as we electrify, which we're very much in favor of, the resiliency of the gas grid is still going to be incredibly important. So as we think about challenges, it is maintaining the reliability and the resiliency of the grid. Having natural gas there will help us do that, and developing other technologies in the future will let us fill in the gaps.
Thanks. And so actually, Maryam, I want to go to you on a question to pick up on something you talked about, which was hydrogen. I know you're doing a hydrogen pilot project, so wanted to see what that gives you, what perspective that gives you on sort of the future of hydrogen, and also where the relationship there is with some of the policy issues we've been talking about in terms of what you all need from federal and state governments to make that transition work.
Thanks very much. I think that we're doing a lot of exciting things in the hydrogen space. Some of it is R&D work that we need to do to make sure that as we fold hydrogen into our system, that it is done safely and in a way that maximizes the use of the existing infrastructure. So one technology that we're very excited about is called hydrogen pure comp. And what it does is it allows you to transport hydrogen as a mix in the natural gas system and then extract and compress that hydrogen and be able to have that hydrogen in a pure form for heavy duty transportation or other applications. And what makes that so very exciting is that it really allows the possibility of hydrogen being able to be available anywhere that you have an existing gas infrastructure system. I think that another exciting project that we're working on is establishing a blending standard here in California. Last year, together with the other gas utilities here in California, PG&E, San Diego Gas and Electric, and Southwest Gas is here too. We filed with the state to set up a process for developing an injection standard. They already have one in Hawaii. And I think what this goes to in the heart of hydrogen really is the issue of scale that has been brought up by so many of our colleagues needing to have hydrogen at scale. And it is very important to bring down the cost of the production of hydrogen. But about a third of the cost of hydrogen delivery is actually the transport. So the more we can bring down costs by leveraging the existing gas infrastructure system, the faster we get to that scale on hydrogen that we're all driving for. I think that there's a lot of conversation. The United States, I think, we're catching up to a lot of conversation on blending that's happening globally. And maybe, to your question about policy opportunities, maybe this is an opportunity on blending where there needs to be collaboration on setting a standard nationally and even internationally as these same questions are being asked in Europe and in Asia and in Australia. I think that as far as policies to support, a lot was spoken to about a price on carbon, or more particularly an effective price on carbon. We have something like that here in California called a low carbon fuel standard that applies to the transportation sector. And it's been a really good policy to incubate and develop renewable natural gas technologies and create the economics there. There are really good conversations going on in Washington, D.C. in the form of that infrastructure package to support hydrogen hubs. Leo talked about the center of gravity in the Gulf Coast, and in particular Louisiana, my home state, around hydrogen. And there's a lot of momentum here in California, in LA. Our large muni, LADWP, is a leader in seeking to transform their power fleet to hydrogen. And that has really become a possible anchor customer for a hydrogen hub, so to speak, here. And we think that the opportunity for federal support there will be really great.
Thanks. That's some really good sort of concrete suggestions. I mean, you've mentioned the role potentially of a carbon price, an effective carbon price, but also some of the more technology specific issues or the ideas like a hydrogen hub. So let me shift gears a little bit, although I want to stay with you, Maryam, because I want to pick up on something you mentioned in your opener, and then really ask the others on the panel to reflect on this as well. And that's this issue that's come up a bunch of times about resilience. We're seeing extreme weather everywhere in the country, really takes different forms, but we're seeing it more and more as a result of climate change. And I think all of you mentioned the importance of building resilience. And I just would love to hear a little bit more on how each of your companies is thinking about strengthening resilience and responding to what we know will be a rising threat of climate impact. So Maryam, maybe I can stick with you, and then Leo, I can go to you if you want to pick up on that, and then back around the circle.
Sure, I'll be super brief. I think that the issue of resiliency is one where the gas infrastructure system has clearly an advantage because much of our system is already underground. And what that gives us is it protects our infrastructure assets from externalities, which a lot of times is one of the things that compromises resiliency. And I think that, as I was saying earlier, I think it's one of the things that makes clean gases a perfect partner with clean electrons, clean power as we drive to net zero. But then, as far as further increasing the resiliency, further enhancing the resiliency of our own system, we are doing a lot of exciting things in the world of digital solutions and AI, and using drones to really enhance our system to make sure that it can perform, to avoid compromises to resiliency. So a lot of good work there, I think, in the gas industry for us and broadly.
Great, thanks. Leo, let me turn to you next on this.
Resiliency has always been a part of what we do. And just to give you context, over the last 5 years, we spent about $9.5 billion on T&D infrastructure that meets or exceeds current standards for wind resistance and flooding, and whether it's in our substations or transmission and distribution poles. And I think we've had the unfortunate privilege to be able to actually test a lot of the new infrastructure out. So if you think about new transmission structures, for example, that are designed to withstand 150-mile-an-hour winds, twice in the last 12 months, we've actually experienced over 150-mile-an-hour winds across our transmission infrastructure in two different sections of our footprint. And all of those structures withstood the wind. So during Hurricane Laura, while we did have a significant amount of transmission towers that were destroyed, they were all the older technology structures. And I can tell you, I stood between two transmission lines that were 200 yards apart, going through the same corridor of South Louisiana last year after Hurricane Laura. And one set of those structures that were older structures built to old design standards were destroyed. The other line that ran completely parallel to it, only 200 yards away, unscathed throughout that storm. Similarly, in the path of Hurricane Ida, just as in August, same day, August 29th, it's become a bad day around here. Katrina, Laura, Ida all hit on August 29th. But on August 29th, when Ida hit, not only did it go through a section of South Louisiana, it stalled for 15 hours over South Louisiana. Significant damage to our distribution system and some damage to transmission as well. But similar to that, it went right over a section of 390 brand new transmission structures designed for 150-mile-an-hour winds as a Category 4 storm with 150-plus-mile-an-hour winds. And those transmission structures were not destroyed. So we had a couple of them damaged by debris. And when I say debris, barges that were cut loose on the Mississippi River and smashed into them, damaged the poles, did not destroy them. So the whole point of that is we know we have to step up our game in resiliency. And what we're seeing, though, is the new technology does actually work. What's changed now that as climate science has evolved and as empirical evidence has evolved, what's really changed is when we do the cost-benefit relationship of what these resiliency investments should be, it's different in 2021 than it would have been in 2000. And so in the year 2000, when you were looking at, should I replace like-for-like transmission poles when these are perfectly good, designed to 110-mile-an-hour standard south of I-10 in Louisiana, Maryam will know what I mean, or should I upgrade that existing perfectly useful transmission structure with one that withstands 150-mile-an-hour wind? I've got to look at a stronger, more frequent occurrence of a hurricane hitting the Gulf South. And if I believe that that's the case, now a cost-benefit relationship has changed, and maybe I accelerate that resiliency investment beyond what we've been doing. We already have, as I said, spent $9.5 billion on resiliency over the course of the last 5 years. And every time one of those transmission or distribution poles is knocked down, we put one up that meets those new standards. So we just know we need to move faster now.
Thanks, Leo. Let me turn now. I'm going to go in the other order: Bob, Gerry, and Ralph. And I'll also say we're nearing our time, so I'll ask you, each of you, maybe about a minute of this and a minute answer on this resilience piece, and then I'll wrap us up. So Bob, let me go to you, and then Gerry and Ralph.
Sure. Like Leo, we're building to new standards. We've been lucky. We haven't experienced the kind of storms that Leo has over the course of the past couple of years, but Virginia and South Carolina are certainly states that can experience severe hurricane weather. So we are building to new standards. We're undergrounding parts of our distribution system. Not all of it, obviously, that would be way too expensive, but the worst performing lines in neighborhoods, ones that we constantly have to go back to, we put those underground so we're not having to deal with that. And sort of on the more high-tech end, we're looking at microgrids and the ways that we might be able to use those to help with resiliency. All of those from low-tech to high-tech are going to be needed as we go forward.
Well, I mentioned earlier that I had called the CEOs of EEI in advance of the strategy session this fall to ask what was on their mind. Number one was the clean energy transition. Number two was this topic. So many people were experiencing intense, out of norm weather that they simply hadn't seen before, that I found CEOs wrestling with, am I thinking about resiliency the right way? And it became a theme, and I pushed it back to our own people at DTE, in which soon on the heels of that, we had 7 catastrophic storms in the span of 10 weeks, never seen it before. Everybody's having these sort of experiences. And so at the fall offsite, the real discussion was redefining what we call the design basis threat for resiliency. How do we think about the real level of threat that we need to design for in order to make our systems resilient enough? We're going to work together on that, but it's really clear that the industry thinks we've got to take the standard up materially given what we're seeing and learning.
Thanks. And Ralph, I'll turn it to you for the last word.
Yeah, Nat, it's going to sound like Bob Blue wrote my comments. I mean, we're doing a whole range from high tech to low tech. You know, we had severe flooding during Superstorm Sandy back in 2012. We literally lifted substations off the ground, and all 26 of those substations during Hurricane Ida did not flood. So we literally had an order of magnitude improvement in customer outages just by doing something as low tech as that. On the other hand, as others have mentioned, with the deployment of AMI, we can get much more specific information about which customers are out. Through data analytics, we can target critical circuits more intelligently in terms of what needs to be fixed. And as Leo mentioned, we have transmission towers that have given customers everything that they paid for and then some, and it's time to replace them with different construction standards. But I do think the number one thing we can do from a resiliency point of view is just reduce our carbon emissions. Tomorrow morning, we'll be announcing that we're joining the United Nations Race to Zero. So we're going to put some science-based targets behind our net zero commitment by 2030 in the form of more specific timeline of how we're going to get there. So unfortunately, we do have to take these actions, but what we really need to be focused on is eliminating the need for those adaptations to begin with.
Well, Ralph, and that takes us fully back full circle. And just the point I was going to raise too, we see all of this need to, invest in resilience and adapt to the climate changes that are irreversible, that are already baked in. We know that more are coming, but the most important thing we can do is accelerate that transition to net zero. Thanks so much to all of you, to Ralph, Gerry, Maryam, Bob, and Leo for a great panel. Thank you for joining us. And thanks all of you in the audience for listening in. We're now going to take a 30-minute break and resume our program at 3:30 Eastern Time. Thanks.